Welcome back to the Sports Media Backhaul. Galen Clavio here. It's been a while since we had our last episode, but the moment has struck us, and it's time to talk once again about what's going on in the sports media world. We got a special guest, and we've completely crossed up our podcasting streams here because we've got Brian Moritz from the Flip Side joining us. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great. Now, this has got to be what you count the Flip Side, you count this, you count the other 51, the sports, the NJSC. This is like the 18th podcast we've done, different podcasts that we've done together.
We are basically children of the digital age when, you just like keep inventing new brands until something sticks, which is kind of what we're talking about today on this episode. So we'll just go ahead and dive right into it. So there was a story that popped up last week. Actually, I guess it was over the weekend about Clay Helton, the embattled head football coach of the USC Trojans, supposedly being given his walking papers by USC. And this was announced by one of these Mavens, these local quasi-independent publishers bearing the Sports Illustrated brand name. In this case, the gentleman's name was Adam Maya, working for SI Trojans. Only problem with this report, apparently, was that it wasn't true, at least not yet. And several national media figures covering sports and college football in particular immediately jumped on this story and said, no, that's not what we're hearing. I think one even said this report is aggressively wrong. I think that might have been one of the Yahoo writers that wrote that. But one of the people that jumped on it and said, no, this is wrong, is Pat Forty, who is now employed by Sports Illustrated. And Brian, I just talked with one of my good media friends about this for a story, and I had all kinds of jumbled ideas about it, and I wanted to maybe just talk that with you for about 10 minutes or so. So first of all, let's talk about this issue in the micro. So you have a person who's part of this Maven system, and the Maven system, for those who aren't aware, is SI basically has a bunch of independent contractors forming their own LLCs and licensing the SI name to them, which lends an aura of credibility to what they're reporting, theoretically speaking. And in this case, now you have a national SI writer, among others, saying, no, this other entity that also has the SI brand name on it is wrong. How does that make you feel?
Confused. And confused by, like, when you texted me and said, do you want to talk this Maven thing? I'm like, huh? Because I forgot that. I didn't know. I had forgotten if Maven owned Sports Illustrated, if they own the Players Tribune, which I just wrote about. Right. I mean, who knows what these weird media things are. So in thinking about it, like, on one hand, you don't want to diminish the fact that, this guy, that the writer for Maven got the story apparently wrong and that he's not being fired. And I went back and looked, and it was sources. So it's not like it was a one source story rushed to the news cycle. He did his reporting, and his reporting was inaccurate. Now, I didn't read the story, so I only read the tweets, which is part of the problem, right? I don't know exactly what the story said beyond the headline. Could be fired. I
can read it to you right now because I've got it up.
Yes.
The story, published December 1st, Clay Helton has coached his last game for the Trojans. USC is dismissing the embattled fourth-year head coach and could officially announce the move by Monday, multiple sources told SI. A school spokesperson said on Sunday afternoon that a decision on Helton has not been made. Messages for Helton were not returned. Okay. And so on and so forth. But that's the nut.
Extremely so it's a definitive. It's not one of those like weirdly hedging stories that you can have. It's pretty definitive.
Right.
I mean, we were saying in our super secret text channel before we hit record, it's, ESPN has done this kind of thing a lot where like somebody at ESPN reports something and then another person at ESPN refutes it or reports the opposite.
We call that the Chris Broussard, right?
Yeah, that's the Broussard effect.
Yes.
Or the Ron Jaworski effect with that thing. And it's that idea of like, and I remember Deadspin having a great piece on how like it's this tail that eats itself and like, it creates more content to create more content.
Well, happened with Adam Schefter. I mean, it's not even the little guys necessarily. Anyway, go on.
No, and so it's weird because I think we have this kind of in digital media, the practice that has organically kind of developed over the last 10, 15 years, especially in sports journalism. It's one of this journalism of process, which I've written about, and Sue Robinson at Wisconsin has written, beautifully about. And it's this idea that this reporting news as it happens is all journalism now. You don't wait, you report it as soon as you have it, and that becomes the story. Now, it sounds to me, that's how I had been thinking about it. Hearing you read the story kind of frames it differently, because it sounds like it's starting to sound like USC was going to fire him, or people thought they were going to fire him, and then they either changed their mind or he just didn't talk to the right people. Who knows? Who can say on that, right? I do wonder if this is exacerbated by the fact that it's under the SI name and it's under like this prestige, Sports Illustrated brand. That's why Maven bought SI in the first place, right? We've talked about that in numerous places, that they bought it for the prestige, for the name of Sports Illustrated. And now it's not ESPN, which is so big. It kind of, has its own weird journalism practices or stuff like that. It's the supposedly, and it also comes on, I'm kind of jumbled like I think you were earlier, but it comes on this idea of media companies being bought out by these like hedge fundy, we want the brand name, and not really understanding journalism. And it's not, I don't think this is like some big sin against journalism. Somebody got a story wrong. It happens. Twas ever thus, it will happen again. And part of the digital journalism world that we have is it gets corrected in real time. We're like, no, I'm not hearing this. Although it is interesting to see it happening within one company instead of communication between like the guy from Maven, and 40 talking to each other, being like, hey, I'm hearing this. Well, I'm hearing this. Well, let's figure out what's going on with that. Instead, you like rush one story out and then you come out with another story, and then it's weird.
Well, okay, so this was one of the things that I was talking about earlier in the story that was being written about this, and I think there's a couple of things at play. First of all, there's what the Maven has tried to do here with Sports Illustrated is keep a national brand, but also have local writers with that brand, but they're not really the same company in any sense of the word. Mm-hmm. I mean, they'll accept the publications, they'll accept the revenue from the click-throughs and so forth, but there's like the individual Mavens, I don't think that they don't have Pat 40 on speed dial, I'm guessing. I mean, I don't think there's much of a connection there. So it is weird on one hand for SI to have almost like an inter-network war over whether a story is right or not, but I don't think they look at these individual Maven writers as particularly important. Like, they're not really there to break news. They're there to churn out content that just gets clicks. I mean, that's how the financial model is supposed to work. It's basically what they said in their press conference announcing that they were going to do all of this.
Right.
But it is interesting that when something like this happens and it's like a wrong story, that SI is like, yes, Pat 40, please go ahead and refute this story publicly. Because on the one hand, you would think, well, gosh, what a black eye for Sports Illustrated. But on the other hand, does it really matter? Like, no. It only seems to matter to sports journalists. And I'm not saying sports journalists' opinions aren't important, but within the context of the marketplace, I wonder if there's really any sort of penalty to be paid by SI or any other publication for that matter for getting a story like this wrong. Because is anybody going to really remember that SI got it wrong even like a month from now?
No, probably not even a week from now. I didn't even know they got it wrong until you texted me about an hour ago and said what happened here.
And what happens if he does get fired? Because it doesn't sound like he's like solidly still there. If he eventually gets fired, was the story ultimately right?
Right. That's like the fascinating thing about it. He might not be fired today. That might not be accurate. He might be fired tomorrow. And then everything that everyone has said to the reporters all along is absolutely true. It's interesting. I was thinking about this. I don't think there's a real penalty for being wrong on a story like this. Obviously there are some stories I think that if you get wrong, there could be a penalty.
Death stories and things like that, yes.
Right, death stories or like, criminal prosecutions or stuff like that. But when a coach is being fired, I mean, it's almost, in a weird way, it's like almost incentivized not to get it wrong, but you don't have to be careful about it because you can put it out there, you get the story. And I'm not saying that this writer did anything wrong. He might have, you might get burned by a source. They might be firing him tomorrow. They might have changed their mind and said, oh, we can't fire him now. It's been in Sports Illustrated, air quotes. But I don't think there's any real incentive. And part of the strength in digital media that we've seen is for every instance where you can say, well, they got this story wrong. Yes, but what about the instant correction where it's right? Whereas in the past, this might have lingered for 3, 4, 5 days or more that they're going to fire him. And now it can be answered within like a day or two and or a matter of minutes or hours. I always think back to, you speak of a death story, when Joe Paterno died. When it was, I think the Penn State student paper reported that he died, and he hadn't died yet. Now, I will always wonder if he was actually dead and they just waited to announce it a couple hours later, because he ended up dying that night and it's forgotten. But I remember that was like one of the biggest, I forget when that was, but it was like a big tisk, never wait, always wait. But then it was like, yeah, think about the reporting that instantly within like a half hour corrected that story and got the right information out there. That's the good part of this era. But no, I don't think there's a huge, I don't think Maven's going to pay a penalty in the credibility era. I don't think people are going to read a Maven. I don't think people are going to read Maven pieces, but if they do, I don't think they're going to disbelieve them because this one guy got this one story potentially wrong.
Right, and I don't think it affects the larger Sports Illustrated brand either, which ultimately is kind of the point. And I think, for people that have this is where it gets tricky. Talking about this, I'm talking with a Washington Post writer about this story, and I'm like, what? I guess I feel like I should be saying, my God, this is terrible for journalism and terrible for the SI brand, and what do I tell my students, and like rend my garments, while pulling my hair out simultaneously. But I just didn't feel that way, not because I think this is good, but because I think this is just accepted practice at this point.
Right.
And as you pointed out, with ESPN and with many others, I mean, you can get stories wholesale wrong. I mean, look at the Manti Te'o story and the things that were wrong in that. And it just doesn't seem to have a lasting impact. And I think part of that is the move from the print cycle to the digital cycle, where you can correct these things and you eventually flood the marketplace with so much other stuff that I don't know that the audience really has a memory of who was wrong and who was like aggressively constantly wrong. I mean, even like if you go to politics, even outlets that are aggressively constantly wrong eventually develop a group of people who follow them almost because they're aggressively constantly wrong, because their thinking is, well, this must be right at some level, otherwise people wouldn't constantly say it. So
right. And it's that aggressiveness, I think, that gets at it. Like, not just aggressive in attitude, but aggressive in putting stuff out there. Like, there's, it feels cliche to say, but I think it's true. There's so much news. There's so much content. There's so much stuff going on that, no, I don't think this is going to have a lasting impact on Sports Illustrated. And like I said, I'm not going to be rending my garments either, because it's going to be like, because again, I think part of it is we don't know how or why the story's wrong. Whereas,
right now we're just taking the word of Pete Thamel and Pat Forty that their sources are better than this guy's source, and we can look at it and say, well, Clay Helton wasn't fired on Monday, so the story must obviously be false. And yet, Greg Schiano just went from aggressively not hired by Rutgers to being the Rutgers head coach in like a 72-hour span. So you just got to
change.
You have to pump the brake. You have to pump the brakes on pumping the brakes sometimes.
Right. And he said he's going to be fired, and it could be as early as Monday.
Yeah.
Okay. It could be Tuesday. It could be next week while they get paperwork ready. I'm reminded of Bender talking on Futurama. Like, you can guarantee me an Oscar. I can guarantee you anything you want. It could happen any day of the week. But until, and it's a weird place to be in, because like that story was potentially wrong, but now we don't know. And I don't think, I just think it's kind of the price of doing business in the digital sports world.
Anyway, we try to keep the sports media back call to 15 minutes or less, and that's what we're doing here. So we'll wrap up with that thought from Brian Mortz. Thank you for joining me. This was fun.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to all of you folks for listening in. If you were expecting some grand resolution, we don't have one. Welcome to the business at this point, I guess. For Brian Moritz, I'm Galen Clavio. This is the Sports Media Backcall. We'll catch you on the flip side.